Hi everybody, welcome to a new episode. Joining me today is Dr. Bradley Campbell, who is an Associate Professor of Sociology at California State University and is also the author of books like The Geometry of Genocide and more recently, The Rise of Victimhood Culture. Dr. Campbell, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Ricardo.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. So today we're going to focus our conversation on your more recent book, The Rise of Victimhood Culture, which you wrote with Jason Manning, the co-author of it. So to begin with, could you please distinguish between the three types of cultures that you talk about in the book, the culture of honor, culture of dignity, and culture of victimhood?
Yes. A lot of previous sociologists, historians, others had written about the difference between honor cultures and dignity cultures. And so honor cultures, like many traditional societies, value physical courage or bravery. It becomes a supreme value, and having a reputation for courage and bravery becomes important to your social standing, and this is called honor, right? So honor acts as a kind of moral status in those cultures, and this ends up meaning that you have to respond aggressively to any challenge to your honor, right? So because this demonstrates bravery, and this can take many forms, and there are different kinds of violence and other things associated with honor cultures. But one thing we talk about a lot is the duel, because this is something that occurs in some honor cultures and is kind of really exemplifies that system of morality, where you have someone feels slighted or insulted, and the slight, the insult, is seen as having lowered their honor. It would lower their esteem in the eyes of others, and their standing in society if they let it stand. So they challenge someone to a duel. The other person accepts too, because not to accept the duel, if it's from somebody who is of the right social standing, is also dishonorable, right? And they end up, firing guns at each other or fighting with swords or whatever. Often, a person dies in the duel, and this is something that can seem kind of absurd to people in the modern West looking at it. It seems so reckless, wasteful. All these kinds of things. Like what do you gain? How does it prove that I'm not a liar or whatever I've been slurred as by going and shooting a gun at someone, right? But the idea is that you've established your physical courage, and this is the supreme value in society, and you're demonstrating that you belong, that you have this kind of social status. So the duel we see in honor cultures. And other kinds of violence too. In honor cultures, you're supposed to respond aggressively to certain kinds of insults. Often, this might be insults about your character. It could be insults about the sexual virtue of women in the family. All kinds of things like this. It can take other kinds of forms besides the duel, other kinds of fighting, but. And then also people end up being very sensitive to slight. So you have this idea like you respond aggressively to slights. You also end up being sensitive to slight, quick to perceive yourself as being slighted, because you don't want to, simply let something slide and let yourself be put down, and it would look like you're a coward if you didn't respond. So everything is kind of geared around this idea of not looking cowardly. So cowardice is the opposite of honor here, and it's very important to be perceived as honorable. And then people, you'll also see, so people are sensitive to slight. You'll also see people in these cultures being, people who are concerned with their honor being quick to insult others, so kind of going around insulting people. It also demonstrates, well, I don't care if they respond. I'm not worried about that. So you have all these features that kind of go together in these cultures of honor. And it's something that might not make sense to outsiders, but it makes sense in the context of the culture, especially if you're in a society without strong legal institutions. You need to project that you're willing to stand up for yourself, to make sure that you're not wrong, that you're not slighted, that you'll respond to attempts to dominate you, to violence, to theft, and projecting an image of toughness and courage, can be effective in doing that, right? So honor cultures make sense, but they also go along with a lot of violence and a lot of conflict. A lot of that goes along with it. So the culture of honor began to change in various places. So in the United States, it lasted in the American South certainly up until the Civil War. They were still fighting duels, and certain kinds of honor ideas carried over after that. It had already begun to die down in the North around the beginning of the 19th century. So you have, the famous duel between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr was in Alexander Hamilton had been founding father of the United States, Treasury Secretary. Aaron Burr was the sitting vice president of the United States at the time, and Burr kills Hamilton in a duel. That was 1804. But the reaction there in the North was very hostile toward Burr. That people thinking of him as a murderer for killing Hamilton, and which wasn't what you would expect under the ideals of honor. I mean, he killed Hamilton in a duel and he challenged him according to the rules. So you can see that the culture was already changing then. The culture that replaced it is what many historians, sociologists have called a culture of dignity. So the sociologist Peter Berger, who died recently, has written about all kinds of subjects. One of his a well-known article was called "On the Obsolescence of the Concept of Honor," and so he was talking about how honor had become obsolete in the modern West, and the thing that had replaced it was the idea of dignity. So dignity culture is different from honor culture in every way that I talked about. The idea of dignity is that every human has an inherent worth. Every human being has this inherent worth and that can't change. So the fact that people think badly of you or insult you doesn't matter. It doesn't change the fact that you have dignity. And the idea is that dignity is inherent, and you're supposed to recognize that you have dignity no matter what people say about you. Your social standing is important. Your reputation becomes less important. So honor is a kind of moral status that you can lose, but the idea of dignity is something that each person has, and you just need to live according to it, right? So the idea in dignity cultures then is that if you're insulted, you can just ignore it. We teach children things like "sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me." Right? That's a common refrain taught to children, but it exemplifies dignity culture. The idea that yes, violence is something that you need to respond to. Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words you can ignore. Words won't hurt you, which is completely opposite of the idea of honor culture, which tells you fight back if someone insults you. Right? You can't let that stand. And the idea in dignity culture is that you're supposed to let it stand, and you're supposed to not be bothered by it. You're supposed to have thick skin. So that you're not even quick to perceive insults, right? You're not supposed to go around thinking you're being slighted all the time, and if people do slight you, just ignore it. So while honor culture says respond to aggression, injury, and insult yourself violently, right? You handle those things yourself. You demonstrate your bravery. Dignity cultures tell you if there's violence against you or theft, some kind of crime, you go to the police. Cultures going to the courts, to the police, is considered dishonorable. You handle things yourself. It was weak to need a third party to intervene. Dignity cultures say handle those offenses with the law, but you don't handle need to handle slights and insults at all. You can just ignore them. And so this is why Peter Berger wrote this article on the obsolescence of the concept of honor. So that honor had really almost become obsolete in modern society. People weren't thinking in those terms. Even like the law, in a sense, replaces the law intervenes when there's violence, right? So the idea is that, well, instead of handling violence myself, I go to the law. But it's not that way with insults. It actually tells you have to ignore that. It's not like the law comes in and handles insults against you. So on the very offenses that cause lots of conflict, lots of violence in honor society aren't even considered serious offenses in dignity culture. Now, Berger wasn't entirely correct. Honor wasn't obsolete. It exists among street gangs and many other people, usually more among those of lower status in modern societies. But people still respond to insults with aggression and those kinds of things in certain areas. So there are pockets of honor in modern society. But mostly, especially among elites, professionals, middle classes, dignity has replaced honor. Now, what we began to notice, though, is that many of the ideals of dignity, such as ignore slights against you, violence is very different from insults and words. Don't be quick to perceive slights and those kinds of things. We saw many of those ideas being challenged, especially among the campus left, the activists at universities. So we first started thinking about this idea of a microaggression. So this is a term that I had not heard until 2013, and most people hadn't heard of it. It's been around since the 80s, I think. But the idea of a microaggression is that certain kinds of slights that particularly people who are racial minorities, women, others who are considered to have to be the victims of oppression in modern societies, that they constantly experience what they're calling microaggressions. So they're not it's not the macro or large acts of aggression like overt discrimination, things like that. It's ordinary slights and insults. So we began to see these microaggression websites. So there were students at universities who had created websites where they could list all of what they called the microaggressions against them, and it would be things like there was a website called Oberlin Microaggression. So at Oberlin College, and one of them was someone complaining because she had been in the gym and heard a professor say, "Oh, I'm glad my husband has blue eyes, so that my children will have blue eyes." And the student then interprets that as a microaggression and says, "I don't want casual racism in my professors," and other things like that, but that were people were taking as slights. Some of them obviously awkward statements, at least, or insensitive, and some of them things that really outsiders to this culture wouldn't think of as offenses at all, like the blue eyes thing. But these were called microaggressions, and the idea was that it was a tiny little aggression, right? So in one sense, you're blurring the distinction between words and violence, right? By calling this an aggression. This is something that actually harms people. The old idea of dignity would be you choose whether things harm you or not. Whether you don't. Again, that's why there's a distinction between words and violence. I can't choose whether the sticks and stones directed toward me actually hurt me, but I can choose whether the words hurt me because I have the power of how I respond. But this was the idea here was that these were aggressions, just like other kinds of aggressions, and were actually harming people. They're micro, they called them, but the idea was that that micro didn't mean they weren't important. That they built up over time. So like constantly experiencing these microaggressions would then prevent you from succeeding. Cause depression and all kinds of harm. And so this seemed to be a very kind of different idea because you were encouraging people to focus on slights and very minor slights, right? So instead of encouraging people to have thick skin like in a dignity culture and brush off slights, they're actually kind of compiling lists of them, giving the worst possible interpretation to certain statements. it didn't just seem different from the ideas of dignity culture, but because we had, been teaching about dignity versus honor, both Jason Manning, my co-author, and I studied violence, and so since honor is so important in a lot of violence, this is something that we had long been reading about and teaching about, and we just noticed that, well, in a sense, this was like an honor, like what you'd see in an honor culture, where people were quick to take offense. That they're very sensitive to slight, just like a Southern gentleman in the early 1800s might be, right? But the difference was, there was a big difference, is they weren't handling it themselves through violence. They were appealing to third parties, right, by publicizing them through microaggression websites, and later on, as we've seen since we wrote this, appealing to university administrators to intervene to make it, they've got microaggression reporting systems at some campuses now. Some student evaluations ask if there have been microaggressions in the class, and all these kinds of appeals to like university administrators and others to do something about it. So in a dignity culture, people appeal to third parties like the government or others to intervene if there's violence. There's no shame in that. In an honor culture, the idea is you handle things, but you're supposed to, in a dignity culture, brush off slights. In an honor culture, you're sensitive to everything, but you handle it yourself. And so this new culture was combining certain elements of it. Sensitivity to slight, certain kinds of slight, and appeal to third parties, though. So it wasn't like honor, it wasn't like... and we ended up calling it culture of victimhood because what we also saw is that just as honor is a kind of moral status in an honor society, your reputation for bravery becomes so crucial and so important. Victimhood became a kind of moral status in this new culture of victimhood that was emerging on among people in college campuses. So in the culture of victimhood, then, you can derive a kind of status from being seen as a victim, as a member of a group that's oppressed. And so again, it's not that they're concerned with just slights against anybody. It's slights against people who are seen as oppressed. And in various ways, we saw the victimhood had become a new kind of moral status.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because earlier you referred to the fact that you heard about the term microaggressions back in 2013. And there are many people who refer to the years of 2013, 2014 as something changed around there on university campuses, at least in the Anglophone world, I would say, perhaps the US, Canada, and so on. Was there any particular set of circumstances or conditions that drove the rise of victimhood culture starting on campuses during that time, or does victimhood culture have some sort of historical precedent?
I think both to some extent. So it's always a matter of degree. And a lot of the trends that we're talking about, and even the trend toward victimhood being a kind of status, is something that's more long term, and it's something that exists to some degree in other settings. And so the way we look at it is that it's among certain campus activists, and especially recently, that you see victimhood culture in its extreme form. The idea of but it's always a matter of degree. So just as honor isn't, it's not as if people think it's good to be cowardly in modern society, right? So there's still some kind of notion that this is a virtue, that bravery and things like courage are virtues. It's just that in what we call cultures of honor, that becomes the dominant virtue, right? And it's more important to be perceived as having honor than toward, say, being kind to people, being generous, or things like that, although those might also be important. So they're always a matter of degree. And I think it's also a matter of degree how much status is accorded to victimhood, because I think it's people will always want to side with with people they perceive as victims against oppressors, right? That's part of like perceiving somebody as being a victim rather than that you believe that they're being unjustly treated. And so if you side with them in a conflict against the people that you see as having mistreated them, then you're aiding them, right? So it's a kind of being able to attract support, and you're going to be able to attract support if you're perceived as a victim, is a kind of gives you a kind of status, right? It's the ability to attract support in a conflict. So there's some degree of that in other settings, and I think that has been increasing over the long term, but hasn't. And the concern with oppression and those kinds of things go back to the civil rights movement and things. Now, the civil rights movement in the United States was mainly an appeal to dignity, right? So it was the idea was always that everybody has this equal worth and that it's not being realized. So the idea wasn't that the ideals of the culture were wrong; it was that they weren't being practiced, right? So. But I think like since, but following that, when that became a model of how to interpret the world, right? That there were some people being oppressed and other people who were oppressors, and then being applied to situations that were not as where there wasn't as kind of the oppression even by the government as there had been in the Jim Crow South, then you end up developing this framework where of seeing the world in terms of oppressors and oppressed and all that, and of trying to side with the victims. And so if you're and it's understandable if in conflicts people would want to side with the victims, but it spills over to like research and theory, trying to explain things in a way that will never put people who are considered victims in a bad light. We see that in sociology and psychology and things like that. So there are, I'd say, for decades there are these kinds of trends of trying to of victimhood becoming a kind of status and a concern with it can even again it's not that it's bad or it's certainly not all bad, but can distort social science research and has other kinds of effects. Now, what happened though around 2013 is that, and for a long time there had been these ideas had been prevalent among the far left on campuses. So. Like I said, the term microaggression goes way back, but it was not in the mainstream at all on the campuses or elsewhere. It wasn't discussed in like the mainstream media. It wasn't on campus an issue. It wasn't as if there were universities were not doing microaggression training sessions or any of that. So then the question is, why did this happen in 2013? Why did some of the ideas that had been around among campus activists suddenly go more mainstream, and especially on campuses, but even in the outside world? And we talk about several conditions that are favorable to victimhood culture, and some of these had just been building for a long time, but we would say, so we use the theories of Donald Black, who's a sociologist of morality, and his work has normally tried to explain how conflicts are handled. So anytime somebody has a moral grievance, how do they handle it, whether it's through law or violence or whatever. More recently, he's been trying to understand the conflicts themselves. So, why do people have conflicts in the first place? Where do moral ideas come from? And Black sees all this as the result of social structure, But social structure in this theory means something very specific. It has to do with the social characteristics, the social relationships of the people in any kind of behavior. So if it's a conflict, you're like thinking of people in some kind of moral dispute, you'd want to know, like, are they strangers or are they intimates, right? So that would be social characteristics. Are they high in status or low in status? Is one high and one low? Those differences in social structure then will lead to differences in the way that conflicts are handled. So, for example, if people are in conflicts with strangers, they're more likely to go to use law, to call the police, to sue, than if they're in conflicts with intimates, right? So our friends and family members. And there are other kinds of propositions too about status and other kinds of things. So the handling of conflict depends on social structure. Now, more recently, Black also talked about the source of conflict, and he sees that changes in social structure will lead to conflict in a way. So we can think of conflicts as having to do with intimacy, diversity, or equality. So, not to go in too much, but just like, so something like rape can be considered an act of increasing intimacy, a drastic increase, drastic and unwanted increase in intimacy. But like a peeping Tom, something not as serious as a rape, but also a crime and something causes disputes, is also an increase in intimacy, right? You're violating somebody's intimacy. People also have disputes about too little. There being too little intimacy in a situation. You're not talking with me enough. We're not hanging out enough. And then equality. People may see insubordination as an offense. People may see putting yourself above others as an offense. All the kind of ideas about stealing people's property, changing their status. All kinds of disputes about status. And then diversity. So heresy, can be too much diversity in a society. Can be seen as too much diversity and be a serious offense. But also, I think that attacking someone's culture in various ways, ethnic slurs, all kinds of things are also offenses. So we can kind of divide conflicts into, and having to do with intimacy, equality, or diversity. Now, what we saw with the victimhood conflicts is that they had to do mainly, like, kind of overall with equality and diversity. They are about they're objecting to things that they perceive as reducing equality, right? Increasing inequality between people. And they're objecting to things that they see as putting down someone's culture. So in Black's terms, these were conflicts about what he calls under diversity, right? So too little diversity, not you're putting down my culture, trying to eliminate it, and what he calls then over stratification, like too much stratification, right? You're lowering somebody beneath you. So what they were seeing happening through microaggressions and other things is that people who were lower in status or were being put down, especially people who were from certain cultural groups, right? So there were cultural offenses and offenses against equality. So we drew from Black's ideas to try to understand, well, when do these things become such serious offenses, right? That even minor acts of, like microaggressions, even minor acts against equality and against diversity would be seen as so offensive. And what Black says is that offenses against equality, right? The idea that you're increasing inequality, are especially bad when there's already equality. So we see this in other situations too, like among hunter-gatherers and other and people who are very equal. They're very sensitive to anyone trying to put themselves above others, right? So there's a lot of work about this. And so where there's more equality, offenses against equality are worse. And then where there's more diversity, things like ethnic slurs and those sorts of things. So you combine those, equality and diversity, you're going to get a concern with even very minor slights. So it was actually, I mean, this has been one of the puzzles, is like, why are people on, so we first heard about microaggressions coming out of, a website from Oberlin College. Oberlin College is an extremely progressive place, right? And why were the students at Oberlin College acting as if it were a hotbed of racism and oppression, right? It seems so bizarre, but it makes sense if you understand, the sociology of morality, that they're of course going to be concerned with what they see as oppression against minority culture groups, because there's so much equality and diversity already there among the students, right? So these kinds of, and so we drew, so one reason then for the rise of victimhood culture is the increase in equality and diversity in society, and in these locations specifically. So it's coming out of there. So greater equality, greater diversity leads to this. Also the presence of authority. So just like, honor cultures often thrive where there are not stable authorities like governments and others to intervene in conflicts, and that's why people tend to turn, value handling conflicts yourself. Dignity then arose where there was authority, but victimhood culture also needs stable authorities, people to appeal to, because they're, and so at university campuses you have that. You have the university officials. We have you have increasing numbers of administrators in recent years. So some of these trends have been going on a long time. Some of them are a little more recent. They're actually, the growth of administration is likely a big part of it. Also, modern media technology. So people were able then, people who wanted to, who would be inclined under certain circumstances to perceive slights, to want to respond to them and want to alert others to them, now had the means to do so. They could go online and create microaggression websites. They can go to Twitter, Tumblr, all these kinds of things. And so certainly modern communications made it easier to appeal to third parties. There's also the fact that along with the greater diversity in terms of ethnic diversity and lifestyles and other kinds of things, on college campuses there's been a decrease in political diversity. So and this is something that has changed. So this is part why 2013. This is probably one of the reasons for it. For a long time, almost forever basically, university faculty have tended to be more liberal, right, than the broader society. That has been the case a long time. It's more the case in social sciences than in the natural sciences. But what has happened is that just in the last 20 years, and in the last 15 years, it's gone from liberals being kind of dominant over the faculty being overwhelmingly liberal to the faculty being almost exclusively liberal. So I don't remember the numbers now, but if it's gone from 70% to 95% or something in social science faculty, whatever it is, it's a big difference, right? So faculty then certainly have become much more uniformly on the left during this time. So and this kind of explains one thing that also might seem like a bit of a contradiction with victimhood culture, is that there is on the one hand this increased sensitivity to slights and other kinds of things, and on the other hand this hostility toward those who are perceived as slighting others, right? So there's, it's extreme empathy, or a kind of empathy on the one hand, combined with this extreme vindictiveness toward others, right? So those who are considered oppressors or privileged or blind to their privilege at least are treated with hostility. And then different groups of people, some are accorded victimhood status where where it may be okay to attack conservatives or maybe whites or men in certain, in very vicious terms, right? Almost kind of we see sometimes almost what we might call hate speech in another context. There was an article published just recently in the Washington Post, I think, of "Why Can't We Hate Men?" Right, by a feminist. It's almost literally hate speech. I mean, or literally hate speech. It's talking about hating them. So Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt published an article in The Atlantic in 2015 called "The Coddling of the American Mind." Lukianoff is the director of this FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, that defends free speech on campuses. Haidt is a social psychologist, a psychologist of morality, wrote The Righteous Mind, extremely influential book. And they talked about something they called vindictive protectiveness, right? So it was it's kind of combining those aspects of, on one hand, trying to protect the people seen as victims on campus, but being very vindictive toward those who were seen as oppressing them. And now it is kind of, it makes sense if you put it that way, but it is kind of contradiction, especially when you're talking about minor and unintentional slights like microaggressions, right? I mean, they're acknowledged to be minor, they don't have to even be intentional, and yet the idea is that there's hostility directed toward those who engage in them, and so you're combining this extra sensitivity and empathy with with hostility toward others. And so if you remember back though, when I was talking about before, the idea that offenses against diversity are greatest when there's a lot of diversity, but increases in too much diversity is greatest when there is little diversity. So in traditional societies where there was very little difference in religious beliefs, for instance, heresy was was a serious offense. But since there are different aspects of culture, it's not an all or nothing thing where there is either diversity or not. Like in this case, you have some kinds of diversity, but then not other kinds of diversity. So the fact that you have less political diversity can mean that any political diversity you have is seen as heresy. The fact that you have more of certain kinds of diversity and inequality means there's this concern with people who might be oppressed. And you end up believing then that those people who diverge from you politically are the ones oppressing people, right? And so it's diversity in one area and not in another. Black would predict kind of both of these things, right? That you get a concern with heresy of a kind, and also a concern with trying to put down cultures and that kind of thing. So the culture of conservatives isn't one that's privileged and empathized with in this environment, right? It's these other kinds of cultural groupings. So these are some of the trends, I think, like the greater diversity and equality, especially, but also less diversity politically among faculty, administrators, media technologies, and authorities, the rise of high numbers of campus administrators intervening in all kinds of aspects of students' lives.
Mm-hmm. Right, and it's interesting that you touch there on trying to establish a parallel between victimhood culture and religion, because it's also sort of a religious attitude, right? Because I mean, we have, for example, original sin, because people that are born with a certain gender, with a certain race, that come from a certain ethnic group and so on, they divide them in the perpetrators and the victims, or the oppressors and the victims. So, and they also have sort of persecutions to the people they consider the oppressors, and they have devotees and blasphemers, and in certain, at least in certain courses, they also have sort of an index librorum prohibitorum because they tell
Yeah.
people that they shouldn't read certain things and so on. So it really seems like a kind of religion, right?
Yeah, this is something John McWhorter, the linguist at Columbia University, has written some stuff about comparing kind of the campus activist culture to religion. I think it certainly has these kinds of parallels. I mean, just I think like one thing is that um, I think well religion. And in social science too, actually, science will both have what they do have in one thing they have in common. Despite all the differences, is often seeing the world in a way that differs from common sense. So you're giving these new interpretations to things, and I think and so the victimhood the extreme victimhood culture of the campus activists has all this kind of language and concepts, right, that differ so much from the way people have commonly thought of things, right? Racism means something different, right? All kinds of things. So it's similar in that way. Social science also, will use its own terminology and stuff. And of course, the difference is that social science, though, is not moralistic, right? That the idea, you do want to often look at the world through different kinds of lenses, and the way we talk about conflict. I mean, the way we talk about conflicts, for instance, is different from the way people normally do, right? Like, conflict is caused by too much or too little intimacy or equality or diversity, but ultimately you're trying to explain things and ideally in a way that would be testable and refutable. So I think what it is, what victimhood culture is it's a political and moral ideology. And so that it certainly then has that in common with religious belief, but so does something like Marxism or other kinds of political ideologies of the past, and again, in using their own language and interpretations. So we talk about things like, I think you're right, like there's a kind of original sin, which is oppression, right? That's everywhere, that you are, they even one of the things that we've seen is the concern with the idea that racism isn't something that is simply a behavior or that you can engage in or not, or an ideology that you can reject or not, but that but that there's this unconscious bias that you have to address, right? So it really is like something like original sin, right? That it's somehow part of all of us, whether we know it or not, and we have to have some kinds of techniques to overcome it. And I think about the different kinds of language and stuff. One of the things you'll see from the activists is, I mentioned people, slurring men or whites and so on. And what they would say, though, is that you can't be sexist against men, or you can't be racist against whites. And this is kind of, again, like a departure from the ordinary way we use these terms, right? The idea is sexism. It might be that sexism against women is a bigger problem in society, maybe, but the idea wasn't ever that you couldn't be sexist against men, or racism has historically been directed toward blacks and minorities in the United States, but the idea wasn't that you literally couldn't be racist against whites. But they're saying even overt expressions of racism or sexism, expressions of hatred toward those groups, can't be racism or sexism, because racism or sexism is about institutional power, and which is, again, just a departure from the way that anybody has, people normally use the term, or we even saw, in talking about censorship on campus, we saw somebody defending campus censorship, and they said the oppressed, by definition, can't censor their oppressors, right? So even censorship is somehow impossible. If you're censoring conservatives on campus, it's not censorship because they're oppressors. So it really is kind of this. And I think that's one of the reasons we were interested in it too, is that it seems so baffling to outsiders. I mean, that's including us. Like, it's from a moral standpoint, a lot of it seems just bizarre. What is happening, and we wanted to try to understand it, like, in terms of, and I think this framework, can kind of decode it, right? To try to understand, oh well, this is the issue, is that they see the world in terms of oppression, period, and that victimhood is a kind of status, and whether you and that you're also seeing in terms of groups, some are just always victims, and some are always oppressors. The very words that we use of the offenses mean something different. That even the smallest slights, like microaggressions, might be harmful. That words are violence. Like they'll say literally violence, not like it's just like violence, but the idea that a speech by a conservative on campus, anything that they've deemed racist or sexist, would actually harm students and can't be allowed, right? It makes sense if you think that these things are actually physically, they're actually harming people just like violence does, right? So it's not a choice of whether to be offended or not a choice of whether to be harmed by somebody else's words and beliefs. Then it makes sense. Obviously, we don't allow violence on campus, so why should we allow this, is the idea. And then I think to outsiders, I mean, it's also the way that, and this is kind of a thing where it looks like a religion too, is that if you're talking about something like sin, then sin can express itself in all kinds of different ways, right? Like, and the idea of sin, it would be that it's rebellion against God, whether it's been through theft or racism or murder or whatever. All those are different things, but they all are sin. And so you have this idea here too that, like, all of what they find wrong is some kind of oppression, right? It's and you'll even so Charles Murray came to Middlebury, and students were shutting down the speech, and a professor was attacked and all this. But one of the things that they were chanting was racist, sexist, anti-gay. Charles Murray, go away. Racist, sexist, anti-gay. Now, the accusation against Murray was about racism. They believed that a chapter of the Bell Curve, which talked about race differences in IQ, they're characterizing that as racist. But then you think, well, where did the sexist and anti-gay come from, right? And it's become a standard chant. And is it, think like, well, does it just not make any, I mean, were these people just uninformed? But I don't think so. I think that to them, and this is, to them the idea is that oppressing one group is like oppressing it all. It's all interconnected, this interlocking system of oppression. So if you're on the side of oppression, you're doing all this. So you can call Charles Murray racist, sexist, anti-gay because you've deemed him an oppressor, so he's all of those things. And then it even extends to things that are offensive for some other reason. So people begin to characterize anything that they find offensive as some kind of oppression. we've wondered about this in different domains. I mean, something we thought of as a kind of moral emaciation, so that you characterize anything that's morally offensive to you as being oppression of some sort. So we were kind of, in thinking about the Me Too movement, which is it occurred in the United States recently. Like a lot of it early on about Harvey Weinstein was you have somebody who is sexually harassing a number of women, even accusations of rape, groping, exposing yourself in the workplace, kind of intimidating people, all these kinds of. So that's completely understandable as offensive under ordinary kind of moral concepts, right? The culture of dignity, anything is, again, it would be appeal to these people aren't being treated with dignity, these women, and we need to stop it. But then you had, but then you have like kind of extensions from that. So as more and more men began to be accused of things, you have some people accused of what seems like merely boorish behavior, maybe ungentlemanly behavior, but it's then still characterized as oppression. So there was the comedian Azar and Caesar. I'm trying to remember his name exactly, but he was there was an accusation of him that he had been he had a woman he'd been on a date with, and then they'd gone back to his place, and he kept pursuing a sexual encounter with her. She finally left, and she wrote about this and called it sexual assault. And again, it seemed more. It seemed that all kinds of people could object to the behavior, right? That for all kinds of reasons, right? That he's essentially going on a date with someone, a first date, and expecting sex, pursuing it when she doesn't want it, but there wasn't any kind of even alleged actual what people would call an assault, and it seems like, again, this kind of extension to calling anything that you disagree with oppression. So we've wondered, about that too. That and that would go along with the idea that almost it's almost like a religion about original sin and those kinds of things. And anything wrong here is oppressive. If it's not oppressive, it's not wrong too, right? That's the other idea. So people have kind of ordinary moral intuitions, but they have to reinterpret them in victimhood terms. So I think, I think that it does have. I mean, it's a political ideology like others, and I think political ideologies have kind of always had commonalities with religious ideology too.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And because victimhood culture stems mostly from university and academia, would you say that perhaps one of the big historical precursors to it would be postmodernism and also the social conflict theories that were derived and expanded from Marx?
Yes, I think so. One of the things we talk about in the book, we talk a lot about sociology because we're sociologists. So and we've seen sociologists, many sociologists embrace what we would think of as an ideology of victimhood culture. That's actually explicitly what they do. It's not really what is dominant in sociology, though there's some borrowing from the concepts, but it's certainly an element in classes and stuff. I think so. In sociology, we often talk about. I mean, it's really weird in a sense that we're supposed to be a social science, but we have like a course in classical sociological theory, right? You wouldn't imagine biologists having like a class where they taught Darwin, right? Like it's a sort of, you either the information is still relevant and it's incorporated into things or not. But sociology is often presented something more like philosophy or something, and we have traditionally had this kind of reverence for people considered the founders of sociology, the classical sociological theorists. How they even became the classical sociological theorists is interesting too, but because there are other people around in the 1800s writing about sociology. But they're usually given as, at least since the latter part of the 20th century, we've talked about the classical sociological theorist as Karl Marx, Emil Durkheim, Max Weber. Now, you'll still see then sociologists kind of appealing to one of these theorists as their as sort of their inspiration, the tradition they're writing in. And if we were picking one, it would be Durkheim. And Durkheim is the sociologist who's actually trying to understand morality from a sociological, from a scientific perspective. Weber also, saw sociology as a science, not quite in the same way that Durkheim did. But then you have Marx, who was obviously putting forth a political ideology as well, and so those on the sociologists who are on the left have traditionally been inspired mostly by Marx. Marx, of course, has a framework for analysis that can be used. Doesn't have to be tied necessarily to Marxist political ideology, but usually is to some extent, right, with variations. And Marx was the founder of what we would call conflict theory, and it's especially brilliant coming from Marx because he's inventing the whole framework, right? It's easy then to apply it to other groups, but the idea of conflict theory is that there is, that there's a struggle for domination between groups. And usually this takes the form of some group is the oppressor, others are the oppressed. Marx was trying, for Marx, it's this kind of struggle for domination between groups is what's driving historical change. And the groups are classes. So Marx said the history of all hitherto existing societies, the history of class struggles. So it's class struggles that are driving historical change. You have one group benefiting at the expense of others. And so whether they were noblemen and slaves, or in capitalist societies, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, right? They're in an inherent conflict. So the conflict exists, again, kind of just by their position in society. So that's Marxism. Now, at first glance, this the victimhood ideology that we see is completely different from Marxism in the sense that it hardly has anything to do with class, right? It's all about women, being oppressed, or gays, or the transgendered, or ethnic groups, right? And that's is what most of the concern ends up being about. Even prior to this kind of the kind of victimhood framework that you're seeing more recently, there were people had taken Marx's general kind of framework and applied it to other groups. So a lot of forms of feminism were essentially Marxism but just replacing bourgeoisie and proletariat with men and women, right? So the idea then is, well, there's this other thing that's important. It's not class, right? So on the one hand, it comes across as a rejection of Marxism because you're then saying it's gender, not class, right? Or it's race, not class. But it's the framework that of oppression that Marx invented. And I think then what's happened more recently is to rather than to focus on a single one of them, to say, well, instead of class, it's gender we should be looking at, or it's race. It's to say that there's an interlocking system of oppression, and this has been called, a lot of people have called this, intersectionality theory, right? But the idea is that yes, it's class, it's race, it's all these other things, right? So but it's not even just that there are multiple forms of oppression, like the oppression of the transgendered by the cisgendered, or the oppression of women by men, and so on. The oppression of blacks and other racial minorities by whites. It's not even just that there are different forms of oppression. It's, as I was talking about before, they're all the same thing. It's an interlocking system of oppression, right? So it's almost as if there's, we've talked about before, it's almost like there's this substance of oppression, like this oppression stuff that's out there, right? And it can manifest itself in different ways. I mean, that's kind of not how they would put it, but it's how it comes across. And so I think, like, it can be unhelpful to call it cultural Marxism, which a lot of people have done, because then you just you end up having people, and we haven't called it that. You end up having people say, "Well, what does that have to do with Marxism? You don't know what you're talking about, right?" And which is true, right? Because it's anyone who is an orthodox Marxist wouldn't see the world this way, right? They would see all these other things as manifestations of class conflict, right? If they're so it's not Marxist really in that sense, but the reason people have called it cultural Marxism is because you are seeing all these other forms of oppression, mostly having to do with various aspects of culture. You're seeing them in the same way that Marxists would see the oppression of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie as being inherent, to the. So they would say, like, just the fact that there's a division between male and female is inherently oppressive, or just just as class would be inherently progressive. So gender is oppressive, right? Or these other things, or the concept of race, or whatever. So that, I think, is where the ideology comes in, and in sociology then, and especially in other fields more than sociology, this often is kind of this. I think of this as this is sort of the intellectual source of victimhood culture. This is where all these ideas come from, that you can't be racist against racial minorities because that's not racism, because it's about oppression of one group by another. It would be like saying, to them, it would be like saying that the proletariat could exploit the bourgeoisie, right? It's not possible in Marxist terms, right? They wouldn't be proletariat and bourgeoisie anymore, and that's how they view men and women and whites and blacks. And I think in outside of sociology, particularly in women's studies or other kinds of ethnic studies and so on, you often see this framework as being dominant. There's a lot of it in sociology too, but not necessarily dominant in the field.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that perhaps one of the reasons why sociology is particularly affected by this kind of approach that people have to science, or to studying, in this case, society and politics and so on, is because of the object of study of sociology is society and the way people interact with one another, and that leads very easily to politics. And because most sociologists lean a lot toward the left or the far left, when they work in this field and when they do their studies, they already have sort of a political agenda in their minds, and they already have the conclusions in their head that the study should lead to, and that's why they still adhere also to these outdated sociological theories from the 19th century and so on.
Yes, I think it doesn't make. I think logically, there's no reason that that sociologists need to be on the left or exclusively on the left, and even historically, it can seem kind of odd, but it's the way that it has ended up. And I think I'll also remember too, it's the case with other social sciences, not to the same degree, but I mean, social psychologists are almost always all on the left too. They're less likely to be on the extreme left, I think, right? Like, but they're liberals, on the left of American politics. But I think, but if we look at somebody like Durkheim, who also considered one of the classical sociologists, it's he's drawing from a lot of conservative thought. So this is something that some sociologists have written about, like Robert Nisbet was a sociologist who was politically conservative, but he wrote. He argued that sociology was, in a way, the early sociology of the late 19th century was actually kind of a combination of conservative and liberal ideas at the time. That they were actually obviously using a liberal framework and looking at human society scientifically, right, rather than just drawing from tradition. Right, the idea this was the Enlightenment framework. We can look at things and use reason and empirical evidence and sort of to understand things. But they also had rejected the individualism of the Enlightenment in the sense that they saw as important to societies and important to understanding how societies work the same things that conservatives saw as important. So the conservatives who were reacting to the Enlightenment, to the French Revolution, to these things, at the conservatives at the time, right? Modern American conservatives are often very individualistic, right? But this kind of this European conservatism, as there was a reaction to the Enlightenment, was appealing to authority, right? Tradition, religion, and the sacred. And all these kind of things, like they thought that you couldn't just rejecting the notion of the social contract, right? Communities didn't just arise by agreement; that they were organic. It was more like an organism that you were part of. And so, what the early sociologists, Auguste Comte, and then Durkheim was very influenced by Comte. What they were doing is saying, well, actually, if we're analyzing society and how societies are held together, what's important to people, it is, the idea of the sacred is of crucial importance. This is something that Durkheim talks about, and looking at rituals and how they bring about community solidarity. Looking at at social connections as being important, families, small communities, rather than simply just large nation states and individuals. And so sociology was, in a sense, using a liberal epistemological framework to understand conservative subject matter, sacredness, authority, and these kinds of things. Now, they also always did have the notion, though, that they were trying to they're using the knowledge to improve society, right? So they were concerned about social breakdown and trying to understand, well, how do we organize societies where there isn't this social breakdown? How do we move into the modern age without societies crumbling? They had kind of these conservative instincts, though, with social order and those sorts of things, but always concerned with reform and those kind of things. So I think sociologists from the earliest days, even when they drew from conservative ideas, were sort of social reformers and liberal in that sense, and also in the sense of how do you arrive at knowledge. Now, so it's been the case, probably from the beginning that sociologists saw their knowledge as likely to improve society. And that's continued. I think along with as I was talking before, they're just in other social sciences as well, in the universities as a whole, the ratio of left people on the left to people on the right has just increased, right? So it's always been the case that sociology was dominated by the left. It's even more so now, and I think that can then distort the research and stuff in certain ways, even when there's not just this explicit left-wing ideology, that it's going to affect research questions and how people answer them. So Christian Smith is a sociologist who recently wrote a book called The Sacred Project of American Sociology, and he was arguing basically that most, again taking this idea of sacredness from Durkheim, right, that most sociologists see themselves as engaged in this kind of sacred project, that by doing sociology, and this includes people, the dominant people in the field who are doing various kinds of statistical analyses of surveys and other kinds of things. It's not just the far left activists, right? It's everyone almost in sociology who sees themselves as contributing to the project of reforming society. They see themselves as on the left, and society is progressing a certain way, and what they're doing is helping it do that, right? Some of them aren't going to be as extreme. Now, because of that, because they all see themselves as engaged in this kind of sacred project, and on the left broadly, and that's what really sociology is doing here. That's our mission. Whether we're if we're analyzing female participation in the labor force, or wage gap between genders, or all these kind of things, like we're doing good here. We're on the side of the angels, and we're helping society progress in a left-wing direction. That's not something that's questioned. Now, even though many of the activists, the people on the extreme left, actually will despise sort of the conventional sociology, right? They think it's not left enough for them, and it's conventional and stuff. But because but the dominant thing is still to see sociology is on the left. So I think many of those who are more mainstream would simply see the activist as, well, they're a little misguided. They're wrong that we're not doing our part. We are, right? And but they don't. They're not. They're going to treat them with a certain kind of understanding that you wouldn't have if they didn't also see themselves as part of that sacred project, right? So they're thinking like, well, they're too extreme. They're not really being scientific enough. Maybe they make the discipline look bad, but still, we're all on the same page here in what we're progressing toward, right? And so, so how does so just extremely unscientific, ideological stuff end up prospering in sociology? How do we list in the book statements from American Sociological Association presidents and stuff, like even though it's not the dominant strain of sociology, these people who are very ideological get elected to these offices and stuff. And how does that happen? It's because that's what so many people see as sociology, some kind of left-wing vision, and so they may even so they may tolerate or even approve of even just the explicit ideological stuff, even if that's not what they're doing. I think so that's how I think sociology ends up embracing a lot of this and becoming a lot of times the intellectual source of victimhood culture.
Mm-hmm. Right. And would you say that perhaps another big incentive that lead people to adhere to victimhood culture or victimhood ideology in this case would be the fact that people obtain a lot of moral status, at least among the people that are part of the same class as them?
Um, yeah, I think it's it's one thing too. It's like it's broader than the universities themselves. So it is part of, I think, like elite culture in general. It's why it's spreading to corporations and these kinds of things. And I think that there is the idea again to to see if you're on the side of the good, you're associated with left wing ideas just to some extent, and trying and demonstrating. It's almost like you can it's bizarre to me sometimes because I think like people who are doing pretty interesting work and scientific work, and you wonder like why if why would they why wouldn't they speak out against nonsense, right? But I mean I think there's this. It's almost as if people see anything slightly to their right is sort of just reactionary, right? And things that are far to their left are simply maybe misguided, right? Or maybe too much too soon, right? So there's never any there's not a social penalty in the university environment and a lot of the environments people are in. There's not a social penalty for being too far to the left, right? Like so, I think, and there can be a social penalty for being on the right, and so you end up, I do think that's partly how things end up like this, and it simply reflects the fact that there are so few conservatives in academia, right? That everybody understands themselves. So many people understand themselves as not conservative, and if you're on the far left, then you're certainly demonstrating that.
Mm-hmm. And is there a good framework for us to look at victimhood culture and try to predict if it could have an important impact in society, particularly in the political realm, and if it could lead in the future, I don't know when or how, to sort of a tyrannical system just to try to correct for the things people that espouse victimhood culture see as societal problems.
Yes, this is one thing too. I think a lot of people might wonder, why is this, why do we care about what campus activists are doing, right? A lot of people kind of dismiss it like, oh yeah, and also not recognizing that things have changed in recent years. They'll say, well, the campus activists were always nutty, doesn't matter what they do. And they'll see it as just focusing on people who are on the fringes and on the extreme. There's also, so for one thing, it's say like this is not as fringe as it was. I mean, for one thing, things have changed. Certainly in, I mentioned 2013 is when I first heard of a microaggression, but things moved fast. We wrote our article on microaggression and moral cultures in 2014, published in 2014, and then at the end of 2014, in the fall of 2015, the campuses exploded. We think of these things as like these victimhood eruptions. So there was at Yale the issue with Nicholas Christakis and Erica Christakis. So Erica Christakis, they were the headmasters of Silliman College. So they're at Yale residential colleges. They'll have professors living there and supervising them. They're kind of headmaster. They were called masters. They've since changed the name to something else because master is offensive in the ideas that reminded people of slavery, right? In itself, an indication of this kind of culture dominating, right? But at the time, they were still called masters. And Erica Christakis, one of the masters at college, along with her husband, wrote an article and responding to a directive from the university about Halloween costumes. They were worried that people's Halloween costumes would be offensive. She writes an article, she writes an email to the college because they often have these kinds of discussions about stuff, just saying that maybe this isn't really an issue for the university. Maybe students could handle this themselves and talk to people or whatever. Students went nuts, vilified her and Nicholas, her husband. Nicholas Christakis is a very prominent sociologist, serving as this headmaster there, but a prominent professor at Yale, sociologist. They're both on the left too, Nicholas and Erica. So he was surrounded in a public area on campus by students yelling at him, screaming, cursing at him. Who the F hired you? All these sorts of things, and attacking them as racist and whatever, telling them to resign, demanding their resignation. They ended up resigning. That was one of the victimhood eruptions. There were others on campus at the time, and people wondering what's happening to our campuses. And I think it's the rise of victimhood culture that we're talking about. Why is it important, though? Is it still just some bizarre students on campus? It's not, because it's moving out of the circles of campus activists, not only being embraced by campus administrators and others on campus, but being embraced by people in the larger culture. There was some kind of panel that Howard Dean was on recently. Howard Dean, former Democratic Party chairman, candidate for president in 2004, but so a mainstream Democrat, a mainstream liberal. And he gave this long spiel, because they were talking about free speech on campus or something, defending the reaction against Erica and Nicholas Christakis, and actually lying about it, saying things that were completely false about the situation. But you think that, if this can happen at Yale and be prominent in the news and not be simply condemned by everybody in the mainstream, and you have people distorting it and praising it, people who are mainstream liberals, then that's an indication that this culture is expanding. Or the fact that university administrations have been embracing it, microaggression training sessions and other kinds of things. Prominent articles written arguing in the New York Times and elsewhere, arguing that speech can be violence and should be treated as such, right? So these ideas coming from campus activists, these ideas we talked about of victimhood culture, being expressed in the mainstream, they're being embraced by corporations who now have microaggression training programs. I was talking to someone who works for NASA recently, and NASA has now training sessions about microaggressions. NASA, right? These are scientists, and so it's moving and moving pretty rapidly beyond campuses. I think part of it too, what's happening more broadly in the culture and in politics is political polarization in the United States, and so the Trump presidency, the prominence of people on the alt-right make certain kinds of arguments too, and Trump and the reaction to that. You have a lot of people who are on the left who are embracing some pretty radical ideas that they wouldn't have before, but it's part of this polarization that, well, there's Trump over here doing this and that, and they're reacting and becoming more extreme themselves. So you're getting more extremism on the right, and you're getting more extremism on the left in American politics. Now at campuses, that it's just left extremism. There's there aren't enough conservatives for there to be right-wing extremism, right? But polarization in the broader society is a part of it. Now, what happens then if mainstream liberals begin embracing these ideas? I think that's something that could change things and move. So we have right now, there's a lot of controversy about the handling of rape cases on college campuses. And so, there were directives during the Obama administration from the federal government for universities to investigate these cases, to try them, that they weren't doing enough to prevent rape on campus. And then if there is a Title IX offense, it's the law that governs what university campuses that receive federal funding can do. Then they had to change one thing that is that they had to change the standard of evidence simply so that instead of something like preponderance of the evidence, or that they would simply have to be where it had to be where the burden was still pretty much on the accuser to show that that a victimization had taken place, and now it's simply the case that if it's slightly more true that if it's slightly likely to be more true that the rape took place than not, then the rapist is punished. So they're kind of getting rid of ordinary due process, and it's not even just the standard of evidence. There's also like the fact that people have not been allowed to question the accuser and other kinds of things. So the standard of due process being eliminated on campuses. Now, that's controversial. A lot of people have criticized this and said that it ends up, people, innocent men being kicked out of college and those kinds of things. The defense is always, though, if people are defending it, is to say, well, these aren't criminal penalties, right? But the logic of it, I think, certainly from the far left activists, is that they should be, right? And I think, when you see, assertions that women should always be believed, right? And it's less like, from the campus activists, it's less that there really is this distinction where the law should really be different, and it's more like, well, we can't do this in the criminal justice system yet, but we do have this power on campuses, and you can easily imagine bringing these kinds of standards to the criminal justice system, and other kinds of things. And if that happens, or take the free speech issue, their argument is that certain kinds of ideas are in fact hate speech, which should be banned. Now, under the interpretation of the U.S. Constitution currently by the courts, there's no hate speech exception to the First Amendment. There are other kinds of exceptions, like about defamation and obscenity and other kinds of things that can be banned. But the First Amendment in the United States guarantees free speech. The government can't censor speech, and that includes anything called hate speech, right? That's not an exception. They're arguing that hate speech should be something that can be censored, right? And that which in itself might not seem as problematic. I mean, there are lots of countries that don't have as you know, the same kind of free speech protections as the United States do, that where hate speech can be banned and things like this. They're not totalitarian societies, or at least not yet. But you combine that idea that hate speech should be banned, and you're thinking of hate speech at first as the Ku Klux Klan or some, the Nazis denigrating minorities and calling for violence against them and things like that. But when you combine this with the idea that they think that sort of ordinary conservative ideas are hate speech, that and attempting to censor campus speakers, and then you end up with the idea that that you could simply censor conservative ideas. Now you're going kind of against basic free speech ideas that are necessary in a democracy, right? If we're going to have elections and we're going to have political debates, then if anything should never be touched, it would be political disagreement, political argument. But that's kind of where many of the extreme activists would like to move us, right? Would like to censor so it would be like, we can think about the things that they've declared are microaggressions, for instance. The University of California had a list of possible microaggressions. They were using in a faculty training thing, and some of the examples of microaggression were things, like I believe the most qualified person should get the job, or and so it's like essentially a disagreement with race-based affirmative action, which is an ordinary political view and a very common one, and identifying that as some kind of microaggression, and then again you get the idea, well, it's an aggression, it's harming people, or the idea. Another one was America is a melting pot. This is something that's been said in the United States for years. The idea, it was actually always a celebration of diversity. The idea was that people, immigrants had come from all over the world and created this common culture. But it's offensive to many of the modern activists because it's saying like, you should give up your old culture, right? It's a melting pot. We melt together instead of being distinct. And so they saw like America is a melting pot as a microaggression. Well, if these are the kinds of things that they think are a kind of violence, even if it's a little bit of violence, and then they also, and it's violence, not speech. They want, they don't believe that that speech that harms minorities, which they say is what this is, should be protected. It should be called hate speech. Then you are looking at something that looks very totalitarian. No due process rights, based on your group membership, right? And are you an oppressor group or a victim group? You get certain rights if you are a victim and not if you're an oppressor. Or speech, you can say certain things or not. That does begin to look very totalitarian and anti-democratic. Those are the goals of many of those who embrace victimhood culture. Whether they can be realized and against opposition is another thing, and that's unclear as of now. What's a little disturbing is the political polarization I mentioned means that ends up being extremism on both sides, and it may just be a matter of who's in power at the moment, right? And rather than having a common, middle and a moderate culture that would value things like free speech and due process, it would be like each side simply like waiting to suppress the other, and that's something that if we end up getting, it's not just about dignity culture; it's about reactions to it and to other things on the right as well. But it's a situation that can be very threatening to liberal democracy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you talked about the fact that people even would like to censor other people just for the fact that they are conservative, and putting aside things, more superficial things like race and gender and sexual orientation, it could turn into a very discriminatory thing in the sense that, as we know from the work, you already talked a little bit about that come from people like Jonathan Haidt, the political leaning is something that is temperamental. So, I mean, people lean to the left or the right according to something that is part of them that is even biological. So, even in the strictly political sense, that from that point of view, it should be, or it would be very discriminatory, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's correct. It's interesting when you see a lot of the debates around these issues, and you'll see, like, a lot of the I mean, I see all kinds of things on Twitter coming from all sides, and there's an idea that is somewhat true, that you can hold people responsible, for their beliefs, like you can for their actions, and not for like immutable characteristics like race or sex. That and I do agree that that's different. I mean, it is very different in the sense, like, for example, you should be able, and again, free speech thing, you should be able to criticize people's beliefs, condemn them, all kinds of things like that. But there isn't just kind of an absolute line where yeah, it's sort of this is why we have free speech and other kinds of things that limit what you can do. I mean, it's part of the reason is that we have, I mean, in general, this kind of the idea of, that part of the reason we have free speech is that we respect people's consciences, right? And we don't, in any kind of society, you have to make restrictions on people's behavior, but letting them express the ideas that they have is not something that something we've decided we don't need to limit, and part of the reason is that people actually can't just change their ideas. People often do when they're convinced, but if I believe something, then I believe it, right? It's not something that we can simply legislate. So you'd be suppressing it. As you note, also, if we really want to, we use kind of as a, as a general moral framework, we hold people responsible for things that they could change about themselves and not that they couldn't. But really, it's our beliefs and our ideas about things are often sort of resulting from our hardwiring, from our upbringing, even, but things that, again, that we don't really have control over once we're at some kind of stage. I think this is something. So one of the things about the victimhood framework is, as I was saying before, it only analyzes things in terms of oppression, and so and only certain kinds of oppression, right? So there's not, they are concerned with disabilities, so that's something that sometimes comes up. The disabled are disadvantaged in a way that others aren't, but just in terms of understanding, like, that there's neurodiversity, that think things differently, interact differently, have different beliefs about things, and that's always going to be the case. There can't, even no matter what the political range of political views is, how left or right it is, right? There are still people on the right and still people on the left, right? Like in whatever society, which is, so again, like if you're going to censor one side, it doesn't work to have you don't have a free society. I think also some people have written about how a lot of the conflicts that people are that you have in victimhood culture result from neurodiversity and things like that. So you may have someone who actually is sort of insensitive and engages in more of the things that people call microaggressions, not just the where are you from kind of things, but or America's a melting pot. But I mean, some of the other things that they've listed. Some of the list of microaggressions have some pretty rude things or offensive things, like someone asking, like, you have say you have someone who has a child of a different race, and ask them, well, are you the real mother? Right, that's the kind of thing that really is bad manners and impolite and stuff. But it's also the case that with neurodiversity, there will be people who are less attuned with cultural norms like that, about conversations, about what you ask and what you don't ask, and what kind of ideas you express when, right? Because a lot of them are subtleties, and even about even with some of the sexual harassment issues and stuff, right, where you're talking about things that are subtle and not things that are clear rules. Like, we can obviously say, yes, don't grope someone, right? But when is a joke, right? Making someone uncomfortable and creating a hostile environment, or when is asking for someone a date acceptable or not? What about standing too close to someone? How close are you supposed to stand? These are things that most people understand intuitively, and many of the people who are violating them understand them as well and mean to violate them, but not necessarily, right? And again, so you can try to set up a situation where there are clear rules that people know to violate or not, but then you're missing a lot of the subtleties. People are slighted all the time, and people are harassed in very subtle ways. But are we able to deal with that, without disadvantaging people who won't understand it intuitively, and also giving an advantage? If you give an advantage to some people and say that anything they perceive, any of their perceptions are correct and will be acted on, you also give them a weapon to punish people they simply want to punish. So these are, some of these are complicated issues. I think that a lot of the stuff we talk about is like banning speakers from campus. Those are I think issues that I think are clear, right? We don't, or chasing out Brett Weinstein from Evergreen State College, or surrounding Nicholas Christakis and yelling slurs at him. Those are kind of the manifestations that seem most offensive. But some of the things, especially when you're talking about sexual harassment issues and other kinds of just like, what kind of environment do we want to create, you do get into complicated issues of how do we balance things against each other. We don't want people subject to harassment, to slurs and things constantly. We don't want the experience of minorities to be to be more difficult than for others on a college campus or elsewhere. But it becomes very hard to deal with these things in anything but a very informal way, because there are so many subtleties involved, and without also then disadvantaging other people. Are you disadvantaging people who don't get those kinds of subtleties that people, because of neurodiversity or whatever else it is?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just perhaps one last question, because I think it's very important for people to really understand this well. That is, we've been focusing a lot on the leftist, let's say, manifestations of victimhood culture, but victimhood culture also has its set of manifestations on the right? And perhaps one good example of it would be the alt-right.
Mm-hmm. Even in our original article from 2014, we mentioned that we talked about conservatives embracing certain aspects of victimhood culture too. Certainly on the campuses, there are a few conservatives, so it's not as big an issue. But a lot of them were embracing, they would, I mentioned before, victimhood culture is a matter of degree. So anytime victimhood becomes a kind of status, there's to some extent victimhood culture there. And we saw, like, you'd see some conservatives often in reaction to the left saying, well, no, now they're the victims. Or you get in, this is something that social psychologists have called competitive victimhood, is that often in moral disputes, you get people arguing over who's the victim, right? It's like, I'm the real victim here. And so that can either take the place of either just kind of trying to, dismiss the whole worldview by showing, yes, that, there's lots of here too. There was an article by a student at Princeton, I think, Tal Fortgang, that we talked about, who, he was responding to the idea that people should check their privilege. Activists were telling people who they think have privilege, check your privilege. And he is, a white man, but he pointed out that, his family members had fled from Nazis and people had died and all this kind of stuff, just showing, like, if you go back, like, there's oppression in his family too. But not that there's necessarily anything wrong with him doing that as an illustration, but it does show a kind of, it's a strategy of, rather than saying, like, oh, this stuff doesn't matter, it's just, it's saying, no, I have all this victimization here, give, me some moral status too. You also then get conservatives, talking about, conservatives being banned from campus and other kinds of victimizations there, and they're often real, but then saying, well, we're the real victims, and you get this kind of competitive victimhood. I think then there's two possible reactions to victimhood culture from the right, and they overlap sometimes too, even though they're a little conceptually distinct. There are two possible reactions that are departures from dignity culture, right? So one possible reaction is just to maintain the old dignity culture. But the others are, one of them is what I've been mentioning, embracing victimhood yourself, like we're the victims. The other is embracing a kind of offensiveness and saying, and embracing oppression itself, and almost adopting the worldview of the left, but being on the side of the oppressors, which is what the alt-right is doing, right? They're saying, oh, we see that, in other words, so a lot of the left will see the world, in terms of, like racial oppression, one group oppressing the other, and the alt-right then will say, yes, that's how the world works, and we have to look out for our own race, and it's, or at the very least, they're embracing identity politics, right? The idea that it's your identity as a member of a group that's important. I think, like, people like Richard Spencer, a white nationalist, somebody on the alt-right who's become more prominent. He's been, I'd have to look exactly, but he's written things like this, saying that, oh, the left is often right about this and this, but coming to completely different conclusions. So it's almost like, embracing oppression. To a lesser extent, when you're not talking about the actual alt-right, but just people on the right in American politics, there has been, like, an embrace of so they'll talk, one of the things we talk about are trigger warnings, right? The idea, that people can, triggers for PTSD are real things, but the way it's been used is to kind of assume that, again, all these kinds of, that there are all kinds of people out who are likely to be triggered by oppressive words or something. And you'll see people on the right kind of, talking about triggering the liberals or triggering the activists, like we want to trigger them, right? And using this, and so embracing, like, just things that just as if offending them becomes the goal, right? We've in a dignity culture, it's not just that you're not supposed to be quick to take offense; you're also not supposed to deliberately offend others, right? Because you don't, because you have dignity, you don't need to care what others think about you. But because others have dignity, you don't need to insult them, and you need to be polite to them. And so there's that rejection of dignity from that angle too, to say that, basically, we're going to, to be as offensive as possible. And you see some of that coming from Trump and support for Trump. A lot of it is like just it has other causes, I'm sure too, but a lot of it is a reaction to the victimhood stuff on campus, saying, if these people are so hypersensitive, let's just go ahead and offend them, right? And also, and as I said, there's an overlap between the two things too. We're the real victims, or we're just going to be offensive, or maybe even oppressive. And you can actually argue both, even though they may seem like contradictions too. But that often happens with moral views, and I think that's something that we haven't written about as much because we're writing about college campuses, and this is more in the broader society. But it's not. But yeah, we don't make any argument that conservatives are immune either to victimhood culture or that they're necessarily paragons of dignity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So, Dr. Campbell, just before we finish here, would you like perhaps to share with people where they can follow your work on the internet, perhaps your social media, and also, I don't know if you want to share with people perhaps some interesting piece of work you're doing right now?
Okay, so you can, so one thing, the book is The Rise of Victimhood Culture. You can get that on Amazon. We also have a blog called The Victimhood Report, which you can find at www.victimhoodculture. I think it's victimhoodculture.com, right? So www.victimhoodculture.com, and it's called the Victimhood Report. We blog there occasionally about things related to the book, things that are happening, different things we want to write about that are related to it. New offenses that pop up. I mean, we haven't talked about today cultural appropriation, but like a microaggression and other things. We're constantly seeing new offenses and applied to new things, right? So we kind of wanted to have the blog to, so we can kind of, keep commenting on different things that pop up. We think that the victimhood culture is, the victimhood culture we write about, we keep seeing it becoming more prominent. So you can follow work there. I'm on Twitter. Campbell Sociprof, S-O-C Prof. Campbell Sociprof is my Twitter handle, or you can look me up in some way. Jason Manning, my co-author in the book, is also on Twitter. Social Geometer is his handle. So coming from the idea that we're looking at social geometry as explaining things like kind of social structure. So he's at Social Geometer. So you can find us there on Twitter or on the blog. Right now we're continuing to talk about this and to write write some other pieces on it. We're also we also work on other things. So this started as a side project because we just got interested in what was happening with microaggression. We're already interested in morality, but I'd written things on genocide. I have a book on genocide. Jason Manning has written stuff on suicide and is currently completing a book on suicide with University of Virginia Press. So we're kind of also a little back to our old stuff, but continuing to think about this and to think about morality sociologically.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so please don't end the call after I finish the recording, because I would just like to have a quick word with you, please. And anyway, Dr. Campbell, it was a real pleasure to have you on the show, and thank you for taking the time to be here with us today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming to my channel and for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel last February and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons, Karen Litzke and Nan Blanchett. Thank you for all.